welcome. Thank you for joining our meetup. It's our May edition here. And we've got our special guest, Johan. I'll introduce him in a second. Really excited about tonight's topic. We have Johannes Fischer joining us. Johan's at PwC Canada. He's a manager there for their Salesforce consulting practice. But he's got this new library I'm really excited to see, Reliability Force. It calls it RFLIB. So he's unveiling this thing tonight. And I'm honored that he chose the Bay Area group to show this thing off. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Johan.
Perfect.
And thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. I'm honored actually to be here tonight as well, and super excited to talk about RFLIB. So quick introduction about myself. My name is Johannes Fischer. I've been working in the Salesforce ecosystem for over 10 years. Started out as a software engineer on Java and .NET, and we quickly had our application integrated into Salesforce. That was a CTI adapter at the time. Then eventually moved over to doing some TrueForce.com development work, specifically for the Salesforce console, and as part of an ISV. Before later on in my career, then I switched over to the consulting side. So I got a little bit of all the flavors of things Salesforce, like when it comes to platform integration. And yeah, I've been since working as a consultant. Part of my role includes development lead activities. I still get hands-on keyboard work once in a while, which is quite nice. And but also get involved on the technical architect side. And as the last piece here says, I'm a developer at heart. I really do enjoy it. Still, it relaxes me at times as well. Hence, I spend some of my free time when I'm not with my family to actually work on little things that I found solve problems. And RFLIB is an outcome of that. So I spent, some of you may have heard it earlier, over the last 8 months, developing on the library. The idea has been bugging me for quite some time already, and I experimented in projects with the context of what you're going to see. But it really came together with the latest Salesforce platform features over the recent month, and super excited to show you guys more. You can see my Twitter handle here at the bottom, so please feel free to reach out and ping me up with a DM or a tweet. I'm more than happy to answer any kind of questions you may have, on Twitter after the conversation as well, if I cannot handle it here tonight. Just for the conversation here, I'm more than happy to answer questions while we're on the go. I have Jody and Cynthia helping me with this, so please feel free to ask your question on the group chat, and then they will basically jump in and reiterate them, so that way I don't have to monitor it actively. And that's it. Let's get started. Well, this is me 10 years ago. As I said, I started working for a software company doing development of soft phones, which are the applications that contact center agents are using to answer calls and manage the conversation while fulfilling the customer service request. And so I started with the company and was put on this legacy application that it was 2007 when I started working on this, and the application already had a few years more on its belt. So it's been around for a while and was using some older technologies. They were not as modern as what we're having today with Aura framework and all the other JavaScript frameworks, etc. What happened is that the application, had its technical debt and did use logging, but every single time there was a ticket opened by our customers, things turned bad really quickly, because for the majority of tickets, there wasn't an easy solution to figure out what's going on. We were dealing with a premise application at the time, so we had no access to the users nor to the servers. All we were getting is log files, and then had to find out, what was going on and how can we fix it with, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but a gun held to our head. And needless to say that was a very painful experience at times where you kind of stand there and you're empty-handed. Like, you don't have the tools, you don't have the information that help you, and you have managers like looking over your shoulder and asking you for updates every other hour. What was really good, soon after, like about a year or something like that we actually had the opportunity to start from scratch again, and we built a new software application.
I'm okay. What's up?
Oh, a new software application, which I'm just going to mute here. That should do the trick. Build a new software application from the ground up, which allowed us to take the learnings from our past and put them into action. And one of them was to make logging a first-class citizen of the application. So we understood the importance of like having good diagnostic information in order to like not only provide a better application itself and build better software, but also like to be able to support it in the field a lot faster than we did in the past. And our new application was very similar to what like we're seeing happening in the Salesforce ecosystem right now, where we moved a lot of the application logic from the backend side of things now into the front end in form of JavaScript, which added additional challenges because the logging frameworks at the time only existed for like the back-end technologies, but for the front-end side of things, it was still very difficult to do because you're running in a different execution context, namely the browser. But we managed to build out a framework that worked with the backend side of code, and which I'm actually really proud of. And this has helped us like enormously to debug issues that were happening in the field. One of the highlights that I'm always proud to talk about is that thanks to the logging that we had on server and client side, and it was very detailed, we were actually able to figure out a packet loss issue at one of our clients, where there were randomly packets dropped in the network layer, and they had some really bizarre outcomes with sessions dying and other little weird things. And it was because of the logging of having the visibility of when information was sent from the server to the client and when it was actually received on the client side as well, that we were able to prove that the soft phone was doing actually what it was supposed to do and pointing at the network layer side. So let's fast forward and see what does that mean for RFLIB and why we're here today. Well, it is these experiences that I just explained that really influenced my career. And so when I came to I think it was around October or something like that last year, and said, okay, I'm going to start building this now. Like it is like the importance of logging that I learned in starting with those early experience and the value that it brings on the flip side, as well as like best practices that I had like followed and continue to develop like on the Salesforce platform throughout the years of working on it, that kind of thought, okay, let's look at things that are in the market differently and see what I can do to help developers build this kind of reliability and operability into their own orgs and their customizations. So the goal of this library is that it helps you to build a solid foundation that you can build then your applications on the Salesforce platform on. As you can see at the bottom, there's the repository link. I personally like to browse libraries sometimes during the presentation. So if any one of you guys is interested in doing that, I hope it was on there long enough so that you can already search it up. I'm a fan of mission statements. So like when I start out, I want to really make sure that I have a clear like single goal in mind that I want to accomplish, that I kind of like feed my feature development back to. In an RFLIB's case, it's like to really help organizations to create clean production ready code with a high level of operational support. While I cannot do the development for you, what I hope is that RFLIB is a good template as to what I believe like clean code looks like. And at the same time, with the patterns that it, I wouldn't say enforce, but encourages to be used within the platform, it should help to clean up your code base and make it easier to test and easier to support in the future. So right now, the library has 3 core features. That's a logging framework, a trigger framework, and feature switches. Now, you might say like, hey, what logging frameworks, trigger frameworks, those things exist already. And that is absolutely true. And there's some really good examples out there in the field. Feature switches, I haven't seen a framework for it yet, but doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The Salesforce ecosystem is certainly like really, really wide when it comes to supporting projects and people sharing. So that's fantastic. If you know about another one, please let me know. I'd be curious to kind of see what else is out there. So while this is great, and the market already has these pieces, I still found there was a number of problems that needed to be solved. For once, I found like throughout my career, like working especially in consulting and seeing different customers and their implementations, that many organizations are still running blind. Like they don't use any of the logging frameworks, which means that when you think about it a little bit more in a business sense, there is still a big market out there for a new framework to enter and kind of like being adopted. Many libraries, they're doing functionality in silos, and that is great. And I like usually that, you know, code pieces do one thing and one thing only. But when I thought about it as part of RFLIB, I decided to go a different way, because I found that if you have those libraries in isolation, it is in the Salesforce platform still, and it's getting better, but still difficult to maintain those and actually create dependencies between them. So if I have a trigger framework and a logging framework, and I want the trigger framework to also log, I need to change it by hand. So I need to update it and have extra work. And like if I was to upgrade it, if it's a feature that is like in active development and I want to get in the latest changes from the community, that's going to be more challenging, because now I have to merge what the community did with my own logging code, for instance. Many frameworks out in the field, they are focusing on Apex. And it makes sense, because it's kind of like the natural thing on the backend side to think about it. But as I mentioned earlier, we're moving more and more into the front-end realm, where we have business logic built entirely based on Aura and some out-of-the-box components, such as force record data that Salesforce provides, and they don't touch even the server side anymore. So now functionality can break without any Apex code being invoked in the context. So you need to know about that, and that's what RFLIB does, because what you will see later, it exposes like the whole logging functionality into the front-end space. And last, like, you know, code only. That's one of the other big pieces that I'm really passionate about. And we had a little bit of a conversation earlier before the presentation started, where you know, it's about bringing the declarative side and the coding development side like closer together. And that's one of the big things that I'll try to do with the library as well. There was a really fantastic tweet that I saw, was it this week or last week, on Twitter, where someone said, hey, Process Builder and Flow, like those are actually just different languages on the Salesforce platform. And so they don't consider, like the person didn't consider them as like admin tools or configuration. He considered them as languages. And I would totally agree with that statement, because you do customize and automate your application with those tools the same way how you do it with your Apex code base. So why wouldn't you have the ability to log in those places? All right. So we're going to be talking in length about logging today. I will touch base on some of the features and differences for the trigger and feature switch framework at the end as well. So it's not going to be forgotten about. But I want to make sure we cover really nice portion about like why logging is important and what you can do with the framework together to get really this level of transparency and visibility into your org. But before we get into the framework and its features, let's talk about logging concepts in a more general way. So the way I see it, you know, it's all about creating code transparency. If code works in a black box, there is no good coming out of it, because you don't understand it. Things go right, great. If things go wrong, like we're back in the situation that I was like at the beginning of my career, where you're kind of sitting there looking at the box empty-handed and you don't know what to do. So the purpose of logging is to create that type of transparency. You want your code to tell a story. And it's the story about what happened at the moment in time when the user was using your application. And you want to know about it because something, most cases, like went wrong, and you want to understand what was happening. So a framework in that sense is helping you to instrument your code and tell that story. And that is for the context that it's the application is operating in. In Salesforce, it's in most cases a transaction in the back end, or it's a browser session in the front end. The important part about storytelling is that people need to be able to understand it. So it should be like written in the language that people understand. Like I would recommend English in general as well. Like doesn't matter if you're actually working in an English-speaking company or not, it's still a good practice to do it overall. But ultimately, it should be readable by the users. And they shouldn't have to do a translation. Like code itself is a language, but I need to translate it. As I read through code, that in a code review or anything like that, I need to translate it in my head into something so that I can conceptualize what is happening. And that is really an important part, that you kind of reduce that effort through the log statements by actually explaining what is going on in the English language. And in modern platforms, they already describe what is happening on them in some ways already. So if you look at the Apex debug logs, like you get a lot of information, but they are more from a machine, like not written for like the users per se that are managing your business logic, but they want you to understand the underlying like platform type of activities. So when I talk logging, I talk about business logic, which is important differentiation to understand, which should be always the first thing you want to read, the story about the business logic, before maybe you have to dive into the platform type of stories on like in between in order to understand what's the problem is that you're trying to fix. So Apex logs can help, but they shouldn't be the first line of defense. And that's really what RFLIB is going to provide to you. It is like this new first line of defense that you have that I hope you will start appreciating very soon after you use it, because I certainly do. One thing that I want to stress here before we dive into the features, and that I'd like you to keep in mind, is like when you look at Apex debugs logs, they always have to be turned on retroactively, because you cannot have them run 24/7. Someone reports a problem, and then you jump into the action, activate logging, and say, can you please do it again? RFLIB monitors your org 24/7. So that means that if it detects that something goes wrong, you get immediately the information about the incident, and you don't have to go back and reproduce, which I think is one of the key elements around this. Okay, we have talked about logging in general. Let's go a little bit deeper into the guidelines and principles for logging from a framework perspective, and I will get deeper and deeper into the framework itself, like as we move on. What you see here on the left side is a snippet out of the RFLIB code base. This is actually part of the LWC log monitor that I created, that we will see in action in just a little bit here. And so when you look at this, and I didn't highlight things on purpose, but I will highlight them with a mouse. Can you see the mouse, Dan? Yeah, perfect. Thank you, team. So as you can see, when you do logging in the front end and in the back end side, it's the same thing. You want to tell the story by kind of building a stack trace in the English language. So every method or function that you have, typically, at least in my applications that I'm writing, starts with log statements. They usually capture like the context of what's happening and information about the invocation. So often arguments that were being passed in and display them on the page. So generally speaking, you want to be really generous around like what you want to cover from a logging perspective, and kind of have like almost all the code branches in your application covered. Doesn't mean that you need to really do all of them. Like if you look at this method here that I'm highlighting, it's so small, and there's only one branch that is easily deferrable by looking at the statement here where this dot page is being printed into the log statement. So you don't have to have another log statement there. Like that would be overkill. But especially when you deal with callback scenarios and different branches based on selected features and that do multiple pieces of business logic afterwards, you want to make sure you have those things covered. Now I say log generously. At the same time, you see here at the right side, reduce the number of log statements. What that means is not that you should log less, but you should combine more log statements into one statement. So like more log information into a single statement instead of having multiple ones. And the reason why I'm saying that is that logging in Salesforce has certain nuances to it, and I'll get to those ones in just a few minutes, where there is a limited set of resources, and governor limits play a role in that as well, that we need to manage, and the number of log statements is one of them. So why I want you to log it generously, like it is important that you don't write 3 log statements one after another, pack those 3 log statements into a single one. That's what it's trying to say here. And then one of the things in logging, and that is across all platforms and languages alike where you have a logging framework, choosing the log levels is very important. Because ultimately it's a way how you can filter the statements and start going from a high level into the deeper levels and like get from abstraction into the gritty needle, into the weeds and see really what is going on. And the way why it is important is in RFLIB particularly as well is because there's a lot of configuration settings where the log level like creates or triggers actions in the library itself, and you want to have proper control about this from a configuration layer perspective. So it's important to make sure that your code base supports that by not like using debug as a statement for everything, but making sure you say like, okay, every error should be logged as an error. There might be certain things that you just want to warn about, and make sure that they have the right log level. And then for the general application, like use info, which is my recommendation, like for most statements. But when you have like statements in a loop, make sure those are debug or trace, because you want to be able to filter them out. All right, so I already said that RFLIB, I already said there are a lot of frameworks in the market, and there's some really good ones too, but there's still things that RFLIB does differently, and I wanted to point those out before we start looking into code pieces and configuration and all that kind of stuff. So for once, as I mentioned previously, it has full supporting for logging in LWC and OR. So you will see later like how little it takes to start getting the logger embedded into your components and start instrumenting your files so that they will create log reports in the future. Many of the existing frameworks out there, like they report logs instantly, which means like you create a log statement and then it's being immediately published, like whether that is to a custom object or via platform events. That's very inefficient from a governor limit perspective, and it's going to be hard to manage and can cause like problems with respect to like callouts and other types of functionality in Salesforce. So what RFLIB does is it's actually building a log stack. So it doesn't report logs just because you write a log statement. It keeps them in memory and then only decides to publish them if it found a trigger event. What is a trigger event? Well, that is, for instance, like an error. So if you have an exception that you're catching, that would be like what you would be like considered as a trigger event, in the sense that you're logging an error statement and you configure RFLIB to publish error statements. And we'll see that like on the next slide. There's a rich number of configuration settings around the logging. And it's using custom settings, which is great because then it means you can have global settings for all your organization. But when it really comes to finding the difficult issues where you have to actually work with your users and have them reproduce problems, you can selectively reduce the log levels for those users and be a lot more quote unquote noisy around them, so that there's more context that you capture for the individuals, while the rest of the organization still operates as business as usual. One of the things that I like to do is like provide utility classes that help to get you more code that does logging out of the box. One of the examples is like the HTTP request. Integration is really important part of logging. Like you want to know the payloads that go out of your Salesforce org and the ones that like come in with the responses. So by replicating like the logging logic in every different org, like you can just simply use the HTTP request object that or class that RFLIB comes with. I made the interface match the HTTP request on the Salesforce platform pretty much identically, so that you don't have to, even if you want to convert your existing classes, you don't have to do a lot of rework for it. There's a small little caveat where I had to change a little bit on how you send out the request, but I hope that actually cleans up your code more than it makes the extra work. And then the framework will automatically log any request, and you don't have to worry about these things anymore, or like wonder if your developers will follow the best practices or not. And then last, as I said, like you have logging support for process build and flow. It comes with the actions to the remote actions that you can just embed in your configuration. So it requires people to actually add the log statements to your configuration. But if they do, you have that visibility and the same behaviors that apply on the code side of things. All right, so when we look at the logging configuration, there are several type of configuration fields that apply, each one for the client side and one for the server side. We'll start out with the log stack, where you basically define how many messages you want to capture before it starts rolling over, which means that if more messages come in, the older ones are going to be just dropped out of the stack. You have that for the client and for the server side. 100 is what the default is. I have not yet had the reason in any production application to actually increase that, but it might be a reason if you have like loops, etc., that you need to debug, where you temporarily increase that for individual users. Then you can generally decide, okay, what should go into the stack. So you define the general log levels that say like, okay, everything info and above should be logged. So that means debug log statements and trace logs will be ignored when they're being written, but you can turn that on then at a later point if need be. But it's again, it tries to be more resourceful, which works generally for the majority of production issues. That should be sufficient as it comes with those settings out of the box. But it gives you the opportunity to kind of get into the weeds when you have to. Reporting levels are the ones that are really bringing things to life, because they will tell you like when a log stack should be published, in the sense so that you either receive an email or you can look at it in the log monitor dashboard that we will see in RFLIB comes with. So it basically means you detected there's something noteworthy and you want to share that with the rest of the organization, in the sense of like the people that support your application on the administrative side. I obviously don't want to take away from the existing like logging features that each of the platform provides. So like system.debug, yeah, set up the level what should go there. Like you can make that a trace level if you want to, so that whenever you turn system debug levels on, that you already see all the details. You can play with that as much as you want to. And on the browser side, you can log to the console. But if you turn those logs off, which you can, like those two platform features won't be fed with the log statements that you write. Then we have like the email log level that tells you, hey, if you want notifications, because the dashboard itself is a great tool to look when something happens, but you need to be alerted to the fact that something went wrong. That's where kind of like the email level comes in, and you can decide, hey, let's say get an email notification sent out to the Apex exception list. and where you already see all the details, and you hear that the problem happens pretty much instantly after the problem occurred. And then one last thing that I want to point out is the logger factory class. So what I've done is like the one thing that is important from a logging framework and that I loved on the Log4j and Log4net Java and .NET side of things is that everything is an interface. You can replace things without having to change your business logic. And RFLIB follows the same practice. So I have a full implementation that comes out of the box, but you can write your own. And maybe like in the future, Salesforce brings out a more sophisticated login mechanism. Great. Like write your own factory, write your own implementation of the logger interface that just basically wraps the Salesforce logging side of it and forwards it to the platform feature. And then just simply replace this string here with whatever you built. And every log statement now is handled by your own implementation. You do not have to go back to any of your classes and touch them in order to do this. Cool. Okay. Now getting into the more detailed type of coding stuff that I hope people are going to be excited about after seeing all the slides. So what are the best practices for using the library in an Apex class? As you can see here on the top, I instantiate the logger instance. I'm using the logger util get factory method, which will use the configuration that you just saw through the custom settings and make sure that it instantiates the factory that you have set for that particular user, and then creates a logger instance with a context. Those contexts are fantastic for filtering and it already gives you a good idea about where you need to look in your code base when a problem occurs. I put one of these into every single class. So every class usually has the class name as the context and a static member that is the logger instance. Now here we're looking at an Aura action method, as you can see here with the annotation on the top. I found adopting the pattern of like wrapping everything into try catch, and then starting with the log statement at the beginning. As you can see, I'm printing in like some of the arguments that I found most important. The syntax allows you to do placeholders, which makes the logs like mock messages a little bit easier to read, and then use a list syntax here to kind of fill in the arguments based on the positioning. You then have your application logic, and as I said, like you can go even further from a logging perspective to be generous with your log statements so that you know whether you entered this branch and not that one maybe, and like have more context information provided. And then eventually on the exception handling side, it makes it easy to report errors. The one thing that I want to point out here at the bottom is this publish log events statement in the finally block. And there's a specific reason why that is there. And as I mentioned earlier, Salesforce has governor limits left, right, and center. We all like deal with them on a daily basis. And one of the important critical things around it is A, the DML statements, and B, callouts. So whenever you want to do a callout, you cannot have any pending database changes. And that's what a DML statement is. If you were to report a log statement, whether that is in a custom object or in a platform event, it counts as a DML statement and your callout would fail. And that is very critical because suddenly you want to get more details of your application by reducing the log level and like be more transparent. And then suddenly you break your application because of that. So what I've done in the library is like I kind of like introduced this concept of deferred publishing, but that requires a developer's help because I don't know when a transaction is really finally at the end of it, and that's what that statement does. So if you are creating something like that is called a batched logger instance, then all the reported log statements will be kind of held back until you invoke this particular method. And by adopting this convention of like following this try, catch, finally syntax in your controllers, you get into the habit of not ever losing out of it. And especially as you apply some more diagnostic features to it, like from a configuration perspective, you don't get any surprises, which is the important part, because this log framework and any log framework, for that matter, on the Salesforce platform can also break your app in very interesting ways. On the Aura side, All you have to do is in any of your components, like include the RFLIB logger component. By convention, I would recommend sticking to the ID. That makes your code very easy and to read and consistent. The context is filled out by the name attribute, which I typically use the component name for it. And then you have an interesting extra little feature which is called the append component ID, which you use for components that are used in your application multiple times. So if you have like a card component that is used within an iteration, if you set this value to true, the framework behind the scenes automatically assigns the unique component ID to the context name. And therefore you can actually differentiate between components in your log statements. As like within the session, you see then like a big chunk of lines of code that may have the same name if you set this to false, but actually are different instances. Setting this value to true will allow you to differentiate from like between those different components. Similar to what you saw on the Apex side, we always start out with like getting the instance of that logger. So in every controller and helper method, you want to have this component find call to get your logger and then start logging the fact that your method was being invoked. It's very easy if you have more complex objects. I personally like to use the JSON stringify methodology to kind of like serialize those contents so that they can easily be read when I process like the log statements in the log in a text editor later on. And then the same principle, like on the Apex side, you just add your log statements. You have the same log levels like on the server side, the same concept. As you saw here, we're using an array in order to fill in the message arguments or placeholders. That just matches basically the syntax that you saw on the server side. When we come to the LWC side of things, it's going to be slightly different. You import the factory method out of the logger module. And then once you have that, you create your logger instance. I usually do that as a constant, like so before my actual module starts. And same thing, provide your context information and then start logging. The one thing that I want to point out here is that you're looking at the message as the parameters are being added or the arguments are being added for the placeholders. You don't need to have the array syntax anymore. So you can just kind of keep on chaining your arguments on the LWC side of things, which should hopefully be a nice code sugar. And then at the end of it, I mean, writing the code is like the log statements is great. When you've done that, it's about consuming them in a nice way. So when I started out, I only had like an email notification mechanism. And as I took the framework into more production-like settings and projects, like I noticed, okay, that's not good enough. You're getting spammed left, right, and center, and you don't have the visibility and the search features that you need to do this. So I started out building a UI to process the logs. And this is what the dashboard is like. It allows you to see logs from a historic point of view. Every new logs are being automatically like added to your context. You see all the details, and it will even go in and does some enhancements on the information for you. So for instance, you always know like which user was responsible for creating a log. And then when you see the details here on the right, it actually resolves that user when you look at the log in details and tells you the name, email address, and phone number. So assuming that you get a notification via email, eventually log into your production org and look at the monitor to kind of see, okay, really what was going on. You immediately have the user information and can possibly hit up that person over Slack or whatever UC tool, your messaging tool you're using in your organization before they probably have considered or got the time to report it. There's a lot more that I will show you guys during the demo later. And that's what we're going to transition right now. So best way to show demo is use something that many people already know and maybe have used in the past, which is the Dreamhouse application. So I started like downloading that and then added logging to it and trigger framework and the feature switches features. And we're going to see all these three things in action now. So we're going through three scenarios. One of them is a DML issue. Then we have like a problem around Aura remote action calls. And then the last one is the most complicated one, which is a data inconsistency issue where there's actually not really an error, but something that is going on. And I'll show you how, like, obviously in a simplified form, how you would go about that in production. Okay, so I'm going to switch here quickly to screen share. Hold on a second. Make sure that I get the entire screen. Okay, and then here we are. Can everyone see the Dreamhouse application? Just to double check. Wonderful, thank you. All right. So I'm not sure if you guys have used Dreamhouse in the past, but as you like load it up for the first time, you kind of want to import like the data sets first. So that's what I'm going to do here right now. I'll hit the import button, which should automatically load all the different bot commands and properties, etc., that are part of the application. But as you can see, hey, something went wrong here. And that's the part where log monitor comes in to the picture. And I'm going to take this out, and we're looking at the monitor application here, and I'll put them side by side. Oops, go here. And you already see that there is a statement added here. And that is for the error that we just saw. I'm going to repeat that so that you see how instantly that is coming in. Got the error message, and boom, a new log message came in. So let's take a look at the log message to see what's going on, find out what's happening. What I see in the context here, obviously have the timestamp. That's always really important. I see the context, which is the sample data controller. Okay, so we're on the Apex side. I got my user information resolved. And then look, okay, what is kind of happening? So you see the history of the transaction here where, okay, the import sample data function was being invoked, eventually started deleting properties. And then you see like already RFLIB prefixed type of classes coming in here, such as the trigger manager. So obviously there was a deletion happening that eventually had triggers attached to them. And then we see what the framework does. And then we scroll to the bottom here, we're getting closer to where actually things went wrong. And then in the log statement, we see here that there's a validation exception. So your property is too old to be listed. What I added is a validation rule where I wanted to say, like, well, if you want to list property in the new, as a user in the application, it should really not be older than 15 days. But we're doing a data load here, and it's when we look up here and look at the different properties that are being added, where in this case, because it's a demo application, there's actually a trigger that randomly assigns different age values to the properties like that came with the data load. You can see here -32, -39. So there are date ranges being used that are certainly more than a -15. Okay, so how we're going to fix that? Well, let's go into the custom metadata, because I created not only like a validation rule to check for this, but I made sure part of the validation rule logic is actually a feature switch. So I created a feature switch that is for data loads, and which I found very, very useful, like across my application and projects that I've been involved in, where you can turn off like all those trigger and functionalities when you have to do massive data loads, either for performance purposes or because the data integrity has been ensured outside, and you don't want to like have the same kind of logic running, because it could also cause problems because suddenly like integration points are being invoked that shouldn't be. So I have a data load in progress feature switch in here that is currently turned off. I'm going in here and changing this feature switch and turn it on so that they say like, hey, look, there is a data load happening, so don't actually run that validation. And as I'm going in here right now and repeat this step, hey, all the imports were successfully now. So that's awesome. That's kind of like our scenario one. Now for scenario two, I want to use the little Dreambot down here. I don't know if you guys have used this little tool before. I think it's actually really handy, and I'm actually eagerly waiting to find a use case where I can use that in one of my projects. I'm gonna go here to the side again and have like the monitor dashboard sitting on the right so that you guys can see it. And then start like just using, excuse me, using the help tool to kind of see, hey, okay, there are the different commands that you can use. Let's see what happens when I use like the 3 bedrooms command. Let's see, oh yeah, here are the different listings, great. But what is when I type, what else can I do? Well, I'm sending this message, but nothing is coming back. Well, the reason for that is that this command is actually not in the list of active commands that are being supported at this point in time. So as you saw here, again, like there was something that went wrong. The frame, like the code caught it in that sense. So there were indicators that like the transaction wasn't successful for the user. And then the logging, like error log statements or a fatal log statement were being logged that were caught by the framework. And it said like, hey, look at the settings, I need to publish this. The one thing that is different from before is that you actually have this fatal statement here, which is coming from the JavaScript helper. So if you're looking in here, you see a lot of messages around like context. Hey, it's looking at the it's downloading the settings, which are the configuration settings from the server side, and then you actually see how I was typing the different commands. Hey, I typed help first. Let's look a little bit further. Then you see me here, how I kind of like pasted in the message about the 3 bedrooms in Boston. And then eventually you see the error again at the bottom where it says, oops, something went wrong in invoking that command. This was the message that was returned by the server. And I have full insight here right now as to what the input was that was inserted into the input field before the error message was logged. So I can see here, hey, what else can I do? And then looking on the server side, you get this corresponding message. You see that the bot command was invoked. In this case, it's called the submit function with what else can I do? And then it tells me here, no handler was found, and it threw an exception. Think about the power that this has. Like, I really want this to sit down for a moment as like activities are happening in your org by many different users, and you suddenly have all this transparency sitting at your hands where you know what is going on. I'm really curious to see if like how many people can give me an indication that they have that type of transparency in their org. Definitely great if you can give me some feedbacks and see like if many of you guys are already on this stuff, then that's great. But it's certainly not matching my experience with customers, but it's fantastic to see that there's a lot more people like on this path already. And I hope still that the tool makes this maybe easier for you in the future and adds more features that you otherwise may have had some struggles with, like in order to get the transparency around it or the visibility in that sense. Okay, so this was scenario number 2. Let's clear that out and jump over to the last one. And let's take a look before I do that, actually, like let's take a look at the console log here. Like I have console log active, so you can see like the messages that you just saw in those log statements that were reported, they are all in here as well. So it's kind of like matching the developer experience, quote unquote, when you have access to the browser right on the spot. So for the last one, I want to go into the property finder. And so I'm getting a user report here that came in. I don't have anything happening on my notification side. I didn't get an email. I didn't get anything showing up in Log Monitor. But someone said like, hey, you know what? I was searching for 3 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, but look at this. In my screenshot here, I see it actually shows me listings where there is 3 baths in it. That's not right. Okay, fair enough. Obviously, like let's look at the Log Monitor side. No events came in. Nothing triggered any thresholds. So what are we going to do about this? Well, that's where the settings come into the picture. So we're going to custom settings. We see the log settings here. And we want to reduce the log threshold for that particular user. I'm doing it globally right now because I'm the only user in that org. But typically, you would create like a new configuration set here for that particular user instance. And the key part, what we want to do is we want to switch, where is it? The client reporting, client server log level here from warning to info. And for the fun of it, that's not necessary for obviously the purpose of the debugging, but I'm setting the client console log level to none so that you see a little bit more a production-like situation and environment. As we saw in the logs earlier, those log configurations are being, oops, wrong one, are being downloaded when you instantiate pages. So I actually need to refresh the page for this to take effect. Well, let's refresh the page and take a look at the developer console. You saw that we have set the configuration settings for client console log level to none. So are we still going to see messages happening after the configuration was received? No. So none of the inputs, like even if I remember here, we saw this when I was typing help, like all this created log statements, none of them are visible in the console anymore. And that's how you can hide those diagnostics from your user base, but still have the full insight into it. But now, what happened on the RFLIB monitor side? Because I switched things to info, there's a number of info statements that have been locked right now. So that is very interesting because obviously I don't care about the bot anymore, but like what happened on the, property list side of things. So as we're looking into this, we'll want to know, okay, why was the number of, where the listings that came back had multiple bathrooms, but more bathrooms than what we had selected. And then what we're seeing here in those statements, as we're going through here, is like, okay, when is actually the request being made? So we're looking here for get properties. That's where the request is being made as a start time. And then we see the parameters. And as we're looking through this list, we now can identify that the number of bedrooms was set to 4, but the number of bathrooms was set to 3. If we compare that to the settings here, that is actually not matching up. So something must be wrong here because the logs certainly don't match what we see in the UI. The interesting part about log statements is not only that they're great to obviously see and read what is going on in your code base, but they actually help a lot as well when it comes to navigating it and finding things in like getting to specific locations. So I can go and take the string of the log statement that is static and then immediately get to the spot in my code where the log statement is printed. So I here see that it's the action parameters that I'm being printed. So I'm going to focus on that, on where those parameters are set. And then I can see like, oh, hey, there has been a naming mismatch. So the number of bedrooms was accidentally set to the number of bathrooms and vice versa. So if I go in here and fix that around, I can save this. It goes back up to my org. Let's wait for this to finish. And then once it is successful, we refresh and just match that this actually fixed our problem. There we go. So going back here, the setting is still set to info. Again, I'm just gonna clear the logs right now in order to show you how you see the logs coming in, like on the monitor side of things. And then we are going to do the same setup that we had before. And now, hey, we only see the listings that have 4 baths. And we can confirm that here too, where we go in, check out the log, go down to the string, and eventually we'll see that, let's see, get bedrooms, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, where's the filter? Filter settings, this is the wrong statement, might be another one here. Perfect, and we see how we're changing things around and eventually gets to the statements that we need it to be. Might be, oh, it's not on this page, on the first page. So we need to look here. That makes much more sense now. Yeah, here we get our results and the page loaded. Here is the statement that we had from before, and boom, the numbers now match up what it should be. As you can see, we have 41 different log events here, and obviously, if you have a number of users, there can be a lot coming in. Two features are there to support you in that range. Like number one is, and we're going even further by starting to do the historic messages, which will load everything from the last 72 hours, which is like a total now with what we've done, 106 log events. I mean, you can go through the pages if you like that, but you can also just like use the search feature to really quickly get to log statements. So if we remember that there was the help statement that we have in several logs around the bot, I just type in help, and now I have 7 log statements that actually match that. So it's super quick, especially when you're using error codes and specific error messages that show up on the screen, that you can search for those one in a larger set of log notifications and immediately identify of what the statements or like log events that this applies to. And then if you have a big issue that is causing you a lot of havoc in production, you can also just basically say, let's disconnect for now. I have the logs that I need. I don't want to get more coming in and distract me. I'll process that first before I go back and look at the final list. Perfect. And then with that, we're going back to the presentation. Any questions at this point? I want to stop here. I've been talking already for 55 minutes, and you guys got the extended version because I was told I don't have to stop after an hour.
We do not have any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat.
Or unmute yourself now quickly if you want to.
I have a question. So this concept of front-end logging almost seems like it hasn't even really existed in Salesforce. People do like a console log sort of ad hoc, but the idea of like taking those behaviors that are maybe purely only happening client side and then logging them to the back end somewhere, that seems new to me. Have you seen this anywhere done in Salesforce or on other platforms before?
Other platforms in some capacity, yes, not on Salesforce. So I implemented the same concept in a cloud application for an educational software vendor, where like even for mobile devices, we were able then to get the log reports in the same kind of capabilities. And that was through a combination of like even JavaScript logging frameworks that are out there with then basically like overriding the logging features and using back-end platforms such as Splunk to visualize it. On the Salesforce platform, like to my knowledge, nothing like that exists. And that's why we're here today, because I truly believe it becomes more and more and more important in the future. I mean, everything is like big push towards LWC front-end work, and for good reasons, right? I mean, it's super powerful what you can create there. But you also like lose some of that operational ability to actually really like dive into any kind of issues and support them. And I think people haven't realized that yet, because I still see a lot of companies that are just getting on the train over the last like year to move their enterprise applications over to Lightning and customize more and convert from Visualforce, where Visualforce you still had the Apex debug logs. Once you converted those Visualforce pages to Lightning, you will actually have the aha effect and come to the realization, man, like how do I know now when something goes wrong? Cool. So we are through the most. Let's talk about the trigger framework and the feature switches a little bit. You did see them in action. I'm more than happy to show a little bit more of the code later on. As I said, trigger frameworks have been around for a long time. I'm not the first one to write one, obviously, but I still like took it on that I wanted to kind of like raise the bar and take trigger frameworks to another level, like ideally from what I've seen out in the field. And so when when I started building this, I wanted to make sure that this is like a full-fledged experience for not just developers, but like admins alike. And have more control over what your triggers do in production on the spot without needing deployments. And so from a differentiation perspective, like the trigger framework that you will see implemented in RFLIB has like 3 core features that I want to point out. And it's fully decoupled. So what does that mean? It means that every trigger, real Salesforce trigger, is a one-liner. And it stays that way. I'm not kidding you. You're creating 1 line of code in your trigger. Even as you're adding new triggers on, you don't have to add more handler statements into your trigger. You don't touch that anymore because it's all handled through the configuration. In order to do it through the configuration, it means that it instantiates the handlers dynamically. You will see the screenshot just in a second where you configure an entire handler. You tell me what the class is, and the framework behind the scenes takes care of all the rest around it. When you look at what benefits that brings, it's like it not only simplifies the implementation because you completely develop triggers now in isolation. It's one class, it just implements an interface, and then you create a configuration for it. You don't have to touch anything else in your org anymore. But it also clears things up from a unit testing perspective. The framework behind the scene based on the metadata manages what triggers are being invoked. And from a testing perspective, you have special access to actually inject your handlers from a testing context. So even if you have 10 account trigger handlers in your regular org today, for every unit test, you can say, I want to only test this one unit, and the other one should be ignored in the context of this test case. And then you can build one test case that has all of them in there, where you kind of do a little bit more of a functional test and see that they work nicely together. But what I found in the past a lot is like you write unit tests and you have for your own trigger and you focus on that logic, and you have other triggers interfering in that or making it a lot more work for you to actually build up the test data space because you need to serve them all. And that's not helpful. It's not good there's a lot of technical debt introduced and a lot of time spent in the context from a development and completing a task perspective. Everything is configured through custom metadata, which means it is deployable, which is a great thing, but then you can go in the org and still make changes on the spot. So it gives you the best out of both worlds. You can actually do a lot more than what I've seen out in the field. And not just about activating, deactivating triggers, but you define the order of the execution of them. And what is new and I haven't seen yet out in the field is like the error handling. So if you have 3 triggers on the account object that are all doing atomic tasks that are not depending on one another, you can say to the framework that, hey, just because one throws an exception, I still want the other two to continue to execute. So you can say, it's like, if the trigger fails, do you want to fail the abort the entire transaction, or do I want to carry on? And that is something that I think is I haven't seen yet in context and could be very useful, especially in the bigger orgs. And then the reason why I went to build a trigger framework is not just for those additional features, but to build in the logging and follow all the best practices automatically that the logging framework of RFLIB encourages. So by using the framework, you will see all the details about what handler is being invoked when. Feature switches are combined with it as well. So there's one feature switch that turns off all the triggers. And it comes with RFLIB, and you can just turn it off. So again, when you come to your data load scenarios, you just have one feature switch to turn off all your triggers, do your data load, turn it back on. Life is good, no deployment needed. When you look at the configuration, you see here there's the standard fields for just custom metadata, and then you define the actual class name. We're looking here for the actual real handler that RFLIB ships with, which is for the email notification. So we're based on the platform event that is called RFLIB log event. Trigger is active. Platform events only support after insert as a trigger. Trigger scenario, there's only one on there. So right now it has the order of 1, but that's basically what the sort order would be if you give them numeric values. I do want to abort the transaction if something goes wrong in this case. Once this is all saved, the framework knows what to do. All you have to do is build the actual physical trigger that invokes the framework. On the feature switches side, it's very similar. If you go and look for the experience for developers in admin, again, custom metadata is key, so you have the deployment support. But one of the things when it comes to feature switches that I found by going down the custom metadata path that was missing is the aspect of like having the hierarchy of custom settings available to me. So I extended like the functionality to actually have a hierarchical control within the custom metadata configuration. So now you can do A/B testing based on profiles, or even individual users start rolling out features for them only, and then further expand to the larger user base around it by using that approach. There is a little bit of limitations around it. Like especially when you look at the more app builder friendly type of a functionality. So when you use like feature switches in flows or in formulas, like you only really have access to the global settings. So you kind of keep that in mind in order to get the best out of your application. So you can configure it for individual users, but it's not trivial as in just adding more configuration to it. You only get the real support for that on the coding side of things. And that, again, is exposed to both worlds, the backend and the front-end side. So you see utility classes very similar in the way how you use the logger in Apex, Aura, and LWC, where you can just say, okay, what is the value for the switch? What is the value for the switch? And the code itself takes care of the hierarchy, where it says like, hey, based on the configuration settings to this user, this value applies. So we've seen a lot about like the features and functionality. We've seen a demo in simpler ways on how RFLIB works and what value it can provide. And I want to close by saying like what value did the logging concepts and the library provide to me personally in my past. I have two stories, quick ones to tell you. The one is using an earlier iteration before RFLIB was built, but exactly the same concepts of what you've seen today. And it was a full CRM transformation. So we had a customer that was transitioning out of their legacy CRM onto the Salesforce platform. It was a big bang deployment. So Friday afternoon, people signed off in the old CRM, and Monday morning, everyone was joining us on the Salesforce side. Needless to say, like it's as a typical project, we did development until the last minute to get everything ready, had like all the data loads happening over the weekend. So things were ready, but also like in still a little bit of a rough shape as the first user signed on Monday morning. We had the logging framework in place that especially was important for the integration side of things. There was ERP, an order management system integration. There was a secondary CRM that needed to get data synced. So as we started out on the Monday, we received email notifications over 200. Like over the 8-hour, 9-hour day that the organization was working. We were able, based on the logs, to categorize those errors into less than 10 different groups of issues, some of them which were data related and others that were actual functional and development issues. Within 48 hours, so between Monday and Wednesday, we got this list down to less than 50 per day. And we were able to prove, like after that time, that pretty much all of those errors being reported were data related issue, because there was a lot of like technical debt from bad data that was brought into Salesforce and we weren't able to fix. And that caused us issues with our automation and integration. The second story is a more recent one and actually really involves what you saw here today. And that is I was able to introduce the framework with one of my clients during like at the beginning of a project. So we used it through the entire development lifecycle, as you know, people were in our own sandboxes, developer sandboxes, where we heavily used like the console features as part of like a community, custom community development that we were doing. And then on the integration side as well, where the feature became really handy was when we entered the UAT cycle, because as users started testing in the UAT sandbox, and that I was typically not in all the time, I kept on receiving the email notifications and saw what is going on. If someone reported to me like, hey, there was something wrong with the integration, and there were a few issues that were data related because the sandbox was just like missing some particular data pieces, I was able to point that out to them by simply looking at my email inbox. I saw the email, I saw the information for that particular case, knew what was going on, and could give them the directions. So instead of me having to log in, turn on the Apex debug logs, reduce, like ask the user to reproduce the problem, which usually takes half an hour and more, I spent literally 2 hours on debugging the issue that they reported on, and kind of like kept them honest on the error tickets side of things. As we rolled this out into production, like we found that there was really good quality, and errors that we found even more non-trivial ones, such as race conditions between force.record data calls to save a record, that we had found during load testing and UAT testing that didn't make it into production. Yet still a couple of problems made it in, and the framework is supporting us. Even today, I kind of help review certain things where we were able to prove that an issue was not sourced or rooted in the Salesforce side, but it was coming from the integration layer, and simply by looking at those logs. And we found like a data import problem already and solved it because we had our logs handy, and it was very quickly debugged, because the integration, obviously it's a lot harder to trigger integration procedures out of a backend system. And we didn't have to do that. We didn't have to ask that team to get involved because we had the log files already available. So if I want you guys to leave like with kind of the pitch for RFLIB, it's really that faster development, faster production support, and more control is what you're getting out of the framework. Not only do you get faster development, but it also helps to increase your code quality. You're creating trust with your users by being able to action when they come with any kind of reports of problems and solving them in a quick way. And then from an administrative side, you will gain a lot of more control through the Salesforce declarative features than you had there before. And with that, we are done. So thank you very much for all of you guys for sticking around. I hope you took away that, you know, the one thing that I want you to walk away with is logging is important, and you should put an emphasis on that in your own orgs, regardless if you're using a framework or not, or my framework, doesn't really matter. Open for any kind of discussions. Link to the GitHub repository is down there if you want to read some of my blogs. I have a WordPress account, and other than that, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you guys coming out.
I actually have 2 questions at this point. So one of them is, you mentioned in one of the previous slides that you can send email alerts for log files. Yeah. So my question was, can you customize those emails, like what's included and when they are sent?
So the when they are sent part is part of the configuration in sense of like log level. So the way I usually handle it in production is that I usually have every log statement that reports on a controller is a fatal statement. On the service layer and higher side of things, like as you go deeper in your call stack, I usually stick to error log statements, and then configure the custom settings to like do emails only on fatal statements. And I just noticed I actually have to update the slides to reflect that better because the sample wasn't pointing that out. But ultimately, it would be like, this is like the combination of like sticking to good conventions on the logging side with the configuration that defines what email notifications you're getting. If you want to go deeper on this, you can configure like who is receiving the logs based on the Apex exception list that Salesforce comes with out of the box. So that is the way how to handle who the recipient list is. But since the whole logger handler is just like a source class, and you saw how the trigger framework works, you can simply just copy that class, create your own implementation out of it, decide any other logic that you want to build in. For instance, for one of my clients, they wanted to have for a specific context, like log context, if there was an email report, that to be sent out to yet another email address that shouldn't be in the Apex exception list. So we created just a different variation of that handler and then plugged that into the trigger instead of the one that comes out of the box.
Oh, sweet, thanks. and I do agree with most of the comments, like this is amazing. So for somebody who's just testing the water in coding like myself, do you have any like step-by-step play that I can follow? And, you know, maybe you mentioned that you want admin to, you know, like tell their developers to try this. Maybe admin developers should try as well. So is there any documentation that, like, is it on a blog or?
Yeah, so I try to document as much as possible, like on the repository itself. So just give me a second and we'll just take a look at it, and that makes things a little bit easier. And that is, where are you? Work too much on the demo lately. So by the way, the demo app is like on my repository as well. So RFLIB-demo, you can download that and take a look at the code. But I really put an emphasis on documentation in the help, like in the README MD file on the repository itself. So as you can come in here, you see like all the code samples, a full overview of all the log setting, best practices from recommendations for production versus development environments, and then like also documentation around the declarative side of things. So if you want to take a look and then see how you as an admin can add like just a log message to some of your process builders, and then bring up the log monitor, assign the permission sets that you can have access to it, and then set the log level to whatever info, and show your developers how by just you going through the process builder and invoking those ones, or invoking your flows, how you have that log context now available, and that you want that from your devs as well, because ultimately you're chasing them. It's for their own benefit, right? I mean, ultimately, if something code goes wrong, you point a finger and say like, not my domain, like, buddy, you go and get it, figure it out. So it's meant to help them. One thing to point out at this stage as well is if you have logs on your process builder and flows, and they touch into the whole order of execution context of a transaction that was based on the DML, you see those logs embedded into it. You see when the trigger that, like, let's say I have a trigger that creates a case and you have a flow on a case in a different scenario, then you see, hey, my trigger created a case, and then you have the log statements that are coming in from the flow in context as well. And as you get like the final log event, you will see all those declarative features in the timeline as they came into the execution. So you get the full transparency of the execution context, like through it. There are no boundaries. That's what I'm trying to say here.
I'm nodding the whole time. Thank you.
Anyone else? Dan, I guess you're up.
Yeah, I was on the trigger framework side of things. I know you've shown some things with Process Builder on the logging side, but on the framework side, we're starting to see things like these before update flows, and I think maybe there needs to be an emerging standard for how you do kind of the like table-driven trigger management kind of stuff like you've shown with the custom metadata types. But you know, how that might work when you're using both a flow and a trigger, because you can call flows from triggers, and from sort of a flow, you can also invoke some Apex, or how would the two work together, or would you enforce one or the other, that kind of stuff?
Oh, you're thinking about best practices in that sense?
Yeah, or maybe even if you've thought about incorporating it into your library, how you might do that. Maybe it's not possible yet, but.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, so again, when it comes to the logging side of things, there are no boundaries. So as you transition from a more declarative programming approach to a programmatic programming approach, you will still get the information from both sides. As far as like what to use, that's always a bit of a double-edged sword and open for debate type of discussion, like on any project. Like my personal guidance is like if I have system behavior that is essential for for my application to function and work as a whole, I usually try to lean more towards the coding side of things, because that is going to be harder to change, and someone cannot just make a modification in production that suddenly breaks a bigger picture of functionality out of it. Generally speaking, I'm a big fan of, again, building code for configuration, meaning that guidelines in my projects and with my team members is always like, if you can build an invocable action that you can embed into Flow Builder, always go for that versus building the trigger itself. Because I'm trying to give you the same flexibility with respect to flow control, etc., through trigger execution, but Flow Builder has that already out of the box, and so does Process Builder. So from that perspective, it's always better to serve the declarative features than to stand on your own. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's hard is Flow isn't quite at parity with triggers yet. You know, for example, it doesn't handle all the DML events. So
Exactly.
You kind of have to use trigger if you want to handle everything for a while, but maybe in a few more releases, you'll be able to say, even stop using triggers and just use Flow to orchestrate all the code that you want to call.
Yeah, I mean,
not that you'd have to. Yeah.
But the visibility of it would certainly be amazing, right? I mean, it's just going to be so much easier to follow code instead of like clicking through a list of files one after another to go deep and follow a call stack, for sure. I mean, the Flow debugger is one of my favorite features, like that, because it does it so nicely.
Johan, also, have you used this in an ISV context yet? Because obviously, when you build your managed package, you can't go in there and put the logs in afterwards. So putting them in ahead of time would be really prudent there. Do you have any good stories about that?
So yes, we did use it in the packages before. Like one of the things that we didn't have is the ability to use platform events back then. So it had to go into a debug object. And if any issues arose, then we basically required a list or an export out of that particular object in order to get those details, which did include the client side. As I mentioned, like I was doing a lot of development in the console and part of the Service Cloud experience. So for those true Force.com applications that had console components in it with like some JavaScript logic and console API interaction, it was crucial for us to understand what happened in the browser and therefore get like this browser side log context and log stack as we were investigating issues. Now with the like, if you could embed like this entire framework in your application, you still require the access, but it's again the reporting side of things would happen as part of your app, and then either you direct a user into the log monitor and train them on it, like for your customers, and then what they will send you is basically the easy way to download the log file here, and then send the text file over, or give you possibly access either via a remote desktop session or anything like that, where you can then start browsing through those details. The key part here is like the historic aspect of it as well, right? While you get the real-time notifications too, which is great when you're actually in a session with someone and want to see them come in, but it's like switching to that historic mode where you get like all the log events again for the last 72 hours. So it allows you to go back quite a bit of time and make sure through search to quickly identify those historic log events that may be relevant for your investigation.
If folks want to try to go off mute, and we can all give Johan a little round of applause here.
Thank you all for attending. Awesome. Thank you, Dan, again for having me. That's great. And same to Jody and Cynthia appreciate you guys' support.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining, and we'll just keep taking it a month at a time here, but we're planning on being virtual next month also. So great to see you. Have a good evening.
You. Good
All
evening,
right.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.